Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English, and we turn now in your hymnals to page 550, 551, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inaugural address. But before we get there, back up for just a second, if you would please, to page 539. And on page 539, let's write this down at level 2B. Our focus here is again the persuasive speech. Now, we just looked at Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech as a persuasive speech. This is actually not so much called a speech, but an address. And the difference is maybe in regards to the context, right? Whereas you have clearly a persuasive speech in the I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King having a clear thesis and agenda that is an arguable thesis. We're going to have different kind of understanding here, a little subtle difference in calling this an address. Why? Because at the beginning of his presidency, the great FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is going to speak to America, and he's going to give that famous line, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Now we're going to hear about some context stuff, but before we get there, just to remind, we're going to be concentrating again on parallelism, restatement, I'm working with you on page 539, repetition, and analogy. All of those were working in Dr. King's speech. Now we will turn to a speech that was given 30 years prior to the I Have a Dream speech in the first inaugural address. By the way, on page 550, again, the question is there a difference between knowledge and understanding or wisdom? And the vocabulary is hypercritical for us to know. Let's meet FDR. Note your dates, 1882 to 1945. Let's read together on page 551. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had a relatively easy life until he was stricken with polio at the age of 39. Now, of course, polio is a disease today most people don't get because when you were a little child, you got what's called a polio vaccine, okay? And so FDR, stricken with polio, which will put him in a wheelchair for much of the rest of his life. Ironically, Roosevelt realized his potential as a leader only after falling victim to this illness. He was twice elected governor of New York. Then in 1932, he defeated President Herbert Hoover to become the nation's 32nd president. Roosevelt won an unprecedented 4 terms as president. And then just to finish, FDR led the nation through 2 great challenges. You want this in your notes. The Great Depression and World War II. The war was almost over when the president died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1945. And then the do you know or did you know, Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, became one of the most active and widely admired first ladies in American history. And then let's get our background information on page 551, the Great Depression. On March the 4th, 1933, newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered his inaugural address to a nation close to despair. The Great Depression had weighed down American life for more than 3 years. Americans sat by their radios to hear the new president's address, a speech he had written himself. In this speech, Roosevelt gave Americans hope. Now, let's say 2 things about this one then before we get started in terms of background. This is a speech which was predominantly heard. You're actually going to hear FDR speaking into the radio. Let's say it out loud for your notes. The quality of the sound's not going to be that great. And you have a different dynamic in play, for example, than you will have with the I Have a Dream speech. The project, however, is remarkably similar in terms of its thesis. In other words, let's put it in our notes, both of these speeches, the I Have a Dream speech and the inaugural address, the background is bad things are happening in America. Let's say this out loud. This is an important part often of what it means to be an American and to appreciate America. Some of our greatest leaders are a product of some of our worst times. Let's write that down. Some of our greatest leaders are the product of some of our worst times in American history. At times when things are really bad, it does seem that great leaders step up and great leaders do some incredible work for us. And here we're going to see that. He's been elected by the American people. And now the question is, what are you going to do for America? Okay? Now, let's address 2 things as we like to do. In advance, I will set you up. 2 things we'll be looking to do in this address study. 1, write it down. we're going to ask this question. What is the central thesis? Write that down. What is the central thesis of this address? What does he want Americans to know? Write that question down. What does FDR want Americans to know? They already know that he's president. So an inaugural address is not to say I'm the president, but rather to address what specifically he's going to do. So what is the thesis? Number 2, what are the primary points of validation? Okay? What is it that he's trying to prove in terms of his thesis? And then how does he somehow help Americans to gain some sense of hope? That things are going to be okay. I'm the guy in charge. It's going to be okay. We're going to make it through this experience. How does he pull that one off? Okay? And we've already talked about this notion of considering the historical precedent and conceding a point, just like we saw with the MLK study of I Have a Dream. We'll ask some very similar kinds of things here. Note your picture on 552. Sitting next to him was the famous Eleanor, his wife. Notice in your freshman year, we're introducing you to a number of really important Americans, presidents as well as their wives. Remember in our study of the John F. Kennedy passage as well, when we were talking with the wife, Lady Bird Johnson, the wife of Vice President and then ultimately President of the United States. So here we go, the first inaugural address. Let's follow along, pay close attention to those 2 questions as we ask them.
First inaugural address by Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
President Hoover, Mr. Chief Justice, my friends, this is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels.
First inaugural address.
I'm sorry, I have to start over to make sure that we're focused.
Mr. Chief Justice, my friends, this is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life,
Top of 554.
a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days. In such a spirit on my part and on yours, we face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. Values have shrunk to fantastic levels, taxes have risen, our ability to pay has fallen, government of all kinds is faced by serious curtailment of income, the means of exchange are frozen in the currents of trade, the withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no markets for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. And yet our distress comes from no failure of substance. We are stricken by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered, because they believed and were not afraid, we have still much to be thankful for. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied.
Top of 555.
Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. Primarily, this is because the rulers of the exchange of mankind's good have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure and have abdicated. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. True, they have tried, but their efforts have been cast in the pattern of an outworn tradition. Faced by failure of credit, they have proposed only the lending of more money. Stripped of the lure of profit by which to induce our people to follow their false leadership, they have resorted to exhortations, pleading tearfully for restored confidence. They only know the rules of a generation of self-seekers. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths.
Top of 556.
The measure of that restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values, more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy, the moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profit. These dark days, my friends, will be worth all the exhaustion if they teach us that our true destiny is not to be ministered unto, but to minister to ourselves, to our fellow men. Recognition of that falsity of material wealth as the standard of success goes hand in hand with the abandonment of the false belief that public office and high political position are to be valued only by the standards of pride of place and personal profit, and there must be an end to a conduct in banking and in business which too often has given to a sacred trust the likeness of callous and selfish wrongdoing. Small wonder that confidence languishes, for it thrives only on honesty, on honor, on the sacredness of obligations, on faithful protection, and on unselfish performance. Without them, it cannot live. Restoration calls, however, not for changes in ethics alone. This nation is asking for action, and action now. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. I favor as a practical policy the putting of first things first. I shall spare no effort to restore world trade by international economic readjustment, but the emergency at home cannot wait on that accomplishment. The basic thought that guides these specific means of national recovery is not narrowly nationalistic. It is the insistence as a first consideration upon the interdependence of the various elements in and parts of the United States of America, a recognition of the old and permanently important manifestation of the American spirit of the pioneer. It is the way to recovery. It is the immediate way. It is the strongest assurance that recovery will endure. In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor. The neighbor who resolutely respects himself and because he does so, respects the rights of others.
Top of 557.
The neighbor who respects his obligations and respects the sanctity of his agreements in and with a world of neighbors. If I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other. But we cannot merely take, but we must give as well. But if we are to go forward, we must move as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline. Because without such discipline, no progress can be made, no leadership becomes effective. We are, I know, ready and willing to submit our lives and our property to such discipline because it makes possible a leadership which aims at the larger good.
Top of 559.
This I propose to offer, pledging that the larger purposes would bind upon us all, as a sacred obligation, with a unity of duty hitherto evoked only in times of armed strife. With this pledge taken, I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people, dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems. Action in this image, action to this end, is feasible under the form of government which we have inherited from our ancestors. Our Constitution is so simple, so practical, that it is possible always to meet extraordinary needs by changes in emphasis and arrangement without loss of essential form. That is why our constitutional system has proved itself the most superbly enduring political mechanism the modern world has ever seen. It has met every stress of vast expansion of territory, of foreign wars, of bitter internal strife, of world relations. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures, as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. For the trust reposed in me, I will return the courage and the devotion that befits the time. I can do no less. We face the arduous days that lie before us in the warm courage of national unity, with the clear consciousness of seeking old
Top
and
of 560.
precious moral values, with the clean satisfaction that comes from the stern performance of duty by old and young alike. We aim at the assurance of a rounded, a permanent national life. We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In the spirit of the gift, I take it. In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask the blessing of God. May He protect each and every one of us. May He guide me in the days to come.
It is significant.